There are moments in relationships that feel confusing, almost contradictory. One day she is close, warm, emotionally present, and you feel like everything is moving in the right direction. Then suddenly something shifts. She starts pulling away. Her replies become slower. Her energy feels distant. She's still there, but not fully there. And you're left trying to understand how someone can want you and still create space from you at the same time. This is where most people misunderstand the situation. They assume distance automatically means disinterest. They assume pulling away means she doesn't care. But human emotions are not that simple. Attraction is not always linear. Feelings are not always expressed in a straight line. Sometimes the stronger the emotion, snorts, the more complicated the behavior becomes. When a woman wants you but starts pulling away, it is rarely about a lack of feeling. It is often about what those feelings are doing to her internally. Because emotional connection doesn't only create comfort, it also creates fear. It also creates vulnerability. And vulnerability is not something everyone knows how to handle smoothly. One of the most common reasons this happens is emotional overload. When she starts feeling too much, too fast, or too deeply, her mind can enter a protective mode. She may not even consciously realize it, but something inside her says, slow down, step back, regain control. Because feelings that intense can feel overwhelming, especially snorts, if she is someone who is used to managing her emotions privately. So she pulls away, not because she doesn't want you, but because she is trying to regulate what she feels. It's not rejection, it's regulation. And this is where confusion begins. Because while she is stepping back internally, you are still moving forward emotionally. You are still present, still investing, still expecting consistency. So the gap between her internal world and your external expectations starts to widen. Another reason she might pull away is fear of emotional dependency. When she starts noticing that she is thinking about you more than usual, that your presence affects her mood, that your absence feels noticeable, something shifts in her perception. She starts questioning herself. Am I getting too attached? Am I losing control? What if I need this person more than I should? That fear alone can trigger distance, not because she wants to lose you, but because she is trying not to lose herself in the process of liking you. People don't always run from relationships. Sometimes they run from the intensity of their own feelings. And then there is the fear of uncertainty. Early emotional connection is fragile because nothing is defined yet. She might like you deeply, but she is still trying to understand what this connection actually means. Where is it going? Is it safe? Is it stable? Is it mutual? At the same level, when clarity is missing, the mind fills the gaps with doubt, and doubt creates hesitation. That hesitation often looks like pulling away, not because the interest is gone, but because the mind is trying to protect the heart from disappointment. There is also an internal conflict that many people overlook. She might genuinely enjoy your presence, your attention, your energy, and the way you make her feel. But at the same time, she might be questioning compatibility, timing, or emotional readiness. So she exists in a state where both attraction and caution are active at the same time. And when two opposite emotions exist together, behavior becomes inconsistent. She comes close, then steps back. She engages, then withdraws. She opens up, then becomes quiet again. This is not manipulation in most cases, it is internal imbalance. Another layer to this behavior is emotional pacing differences. Not everyone falls in love or builds attachment at the same speed. Some people take their time to process emotions. They need space between interactions to understand how they feel. So when things start moving quickly, they instinctively slow everything down. Meanwhile, you might interpret consistency differently. You might believe that if someone is interested, they should remain consistently engaged. But for her, Consistency might not look like constant closeness. It might look like periodic engagement with space in between. So, what you see as withdrawal might actually be her natural rhythm of emotional processing. But there is also something deeper that can happen. And this is where emotional fear becomes more visible. Sometimes she pulls away not because of you, but because of what you represent emotionally. If you make her feel seen, valued, or emotionally exposed in ways she is not used to, that level of emotional visibility can feel uncomfortable. Being emotionally understood sounds beautiful in theory, but in reality, it can feel intimidating for someone who is not used to it. Because when someone sees you clearly, you can no longer hide from your own feelings. And that kind of clarity can make people retreat temporarily. There is also the factor of past emotional experiences. If she has been hurt before, disappointed before, or emotionally overwhelmed in previous situations, her nervous system remembers that. So even if you are different, even if the connection is healthier, her emotional reflexes may still activate old defense patterns. So when she starts feeling attached, her past might whisper a warning: be careful. Don't go too fast. Don't trust this too easily. Don't repeat what hurt you before. And she may respond to that internal warning by pulling back, not because of the present, but because of the past. Another important layer is personal identity balance. Sometimes when a woman starts liking someone, she becomes aware of how much space that person is starting to occupy in her thoughts. And if she is someone who values independence or emotional self control, that realization can create internal resistance. She might start asking herself whether she is still in control of her emotions or whether she is slowly being influenced by someone else's presence. That awareness alone can make her create distance just to reestablish her sense of self. Now, here is something crucial to understand. When she pulls away while still showing signs of interest, it creates a confusing emotional pattern. You might notice she still checks in sometimes. She still responds occasionally. She still engages in small ways. This inconsistency is not random. It reflects the internal push and pull happening inside her. Part of her wants closeness, another part wants space, and both parts take turns influencing her behavior. This is why trying to interpret her actions as a single clear message often leads to misunderstanding, because her behavior is not coming from one emotional place. It is coming from multiple emotional layers operating at once. Now, in these situations, the biggest mistake people make is reacting with urgency. They start chasing more when she pulls back. They start seeking clarity immediately. They try to restore the previous level of connection as fast as possible. But emotional pressure usually does the opposite of what they want. It increases her need for space. Because when someone is already overwhelmed internally, added pressure does not create closeness, it creates more distance. The more effective response is not force, but stability, not emotional escalation, but emotional grounding. Because when she pulls away due to internal confusion or overwhelm, what actually helps is the presence of calm consistency, not intensity. But it is also important to understand something equally real. Not every pullback is temporary emotional processing. Sometimes pulling away is also a sign of reduced interest or uncertainty about continuing the connection. The difference is in the pattern over time. Emotional confusion fluctuates, loss of interest becomes consistent. So the key is not to panic at the first sign of distance, but also not to ignore repeated emotional withdrawal without clarity. What you are really dealing with in these moments is not just her behavior, but the emotional space between two people who are not fully synchronized yet. One person is leaning in emotionally, while the other is still balancing between closeness and self P protection. And that imbalance creates tension. But tension is not always a bad thing. In many cases, it is part of emotional calibration. It is how people figure out whether the connection is safe, stable, and aligned with their emotional rhythm. Still, it requires awareness, because without awareness, that same tension can turn into misunderstanding. One person feels ignored, the other feels overwhelmed. One person tries harder, the other pulls further away, and the cycle continues. Understanding this dynamic changes how you see the situation. Instead of interpreting her as inconsistent or confusing, you start seeing the emotional mechanisms behind her behavior. You realize that attraction does not always express itself through constant closeness. Sometimes it expresses itself through hesitation, reflection, and space. And when you see it from that perspective, your response becomes more grounded. You stop reacting to every shift in energy. You stop overanalyzing every silence. You start focusing more on patterns than moments because moments can mislead you, but patterns reveal the truth. And in relationships, especially early emotional connections, the real insight is not found in how someone behaves once, but in how they behave repeatedly over time across different emotional states without losing their core intention. So when she wants you but pulls away, it is not a simple signal with a single meaning. It is a layered emotional response shaped by attraction, fear, uncertainty, self P protection, past experience, and emotional pacing all working at the same time. And the more you understand those layers, the less confusing it becomes. What makes this situation even more complex is that emotional distance is not always obvious in the beginning. It rarely appears as a clear, I'm done moment. Instead, it shows up in small shifts that are easy to overlook at first: a slightly delayed response, a shorter message, a less enthusiastic tone, a missed opportunity to continue a conversation. Individually, none of these things feel significant. But when they start stacking together, they create a pattern that feels different from what it used to be. And that what it used to be is exactly where your mind begins to get involved. Because once you've experienced a certain level of connection, your expectations naturally adjust to it. You begin to associate her presence with consistency, warmth, and engagement. So when that pattern changes, your mind doesn't immediately accept it as neutral. It interprets it as something being wrong. This is where overthinking often begins, not because you are imagining things, but because your emotional memory is comparing two different versions of the same connection. The earlier version felt closer, more available, more emotionally aligned. The current version feels uncertain, less predictable, more distant, and your mind tries to solve that gap by analyzing behavior repeatedly, hoping to find a clear explanation. But emotional behavior is not always structured enough to be solved like a puzzle. It often reflects internal states that are not fully formed, even in the person experiencing them. One important thing to understand is that pulling away does not always mean she is moving away from you specifically. Sometimes she is moving away from emotional intensity in general. There are moments when life outside of relationships becomes overwhelming: stress, personal responsibilities, mental fatigue, or emotional distractions that have nothing to do with you. But those internal states still affect how she shows up in the connection. So she may still care, still think about you, still feel drawn to you, but not have the emotional capacity to engage in the same way. And from the outside, that looks like distance. This is why timing matters more than intensity in many emotional situations. You can have strong feelings for someone, but if your internal world is not aligned, those feelings do not translate into consistent behavior. Emotional availability is not just about desire, it is also about capacity. Another layer that often goes unnoticed is emotional self P protection during attachment development. As someone starts to feel closer, they also become more aware of potential emotional risk. The closer you get to someone, the more you also become aware of how much it would hurt if things did not work out. That awareness alone can create hesitation. So she might begin to subconsciously regulate how much she expresses, how often she engages, or how deeply she allows herself to invest in the moment. It is not always a conscious decision. It is more like an emotional brake system activating automatically. At the same time, there is often a difference between emotional curiosity and emotional certainty. She might still be in the phase where she is trying to understand her feelings rather than defining them. In that stage, behavior is naturally inconsistent because nothing is fully decided internally. One day she feels closer, another day she feels unsure, another day she feels neutral, and another day she feels drawn. Again, this fluctuation is not always a sign of confusion in a negative sense. Sometimes it is simply part of how emotional clarity develops, but for the other person involved, it can feel destabilizing because there is no steady reference point. Now, there is another important psychological layer that influences this dynamic emotional reciprocity awareness. When she starts noticing how much emotional energy she is investing compared to what she is receiving or even perceiving, she may begin to adjust her own level of engagement, not necessarily because something is wrong, but because people naturally try to balance emotional input. If she feels she is giving more than she is receiving, she might step back slightly to restore balance. If she feels things are moving too fast emotionally, she might slow the pace down to make sure she is comfortable with where it is going. This balancing act often appears as pulling away, but internally it is more about recalibration than rejection. And then there is silence itself, which carries different meanings depending on emotional context. Silence is not always empty. Sometimes it is processing. Sometimes it is observing. Sometimes it is waiting to see how the other person responds. And sometimes it is simply detachment. The difficulty is that silence does not come with labels, it requires interpretation. And interpretation is influenced by emotional investment. The more you care, the more silence feels significant. But one of the most misunderstood aspects of this entire dynamic is the assumption that consistency always equals interest. In reality, emotional consistency is influenced by far more than attraction alone. Personality, past experiences, communication style, emotional regulation skills, and even daily life structure all play a role. Some people naturally express interest in waves rather than steady streams. They engage deeply, then withdraw, then return again, not because their feelings are unstable, but because their expression of feelings is cyclical. Understanding this does not mean accepting confusion without boundaries. It simply means recognizing that emotional expression is not universal. What feels like distance to one person may feel like normal rhythm to another. However, even when you understand these psychological patterns, your emotional response is still valid because clarity is a fundamental need in connection. Without clarity, even strong feelings can become stressful over time. The mind is not designed to stay in prolonged uncertainty without trying to resolve it. This is why emotional distance often creates a natural desire for answers. You want to know where you stand. You want to know what changed. You want to know whether you should adjust your behavior or simply wait it out. But here is the difficult truth. Sometimes there is no immediate answer available, not because someone is hiding it, but because they do not fully know it themselves yet. People often assume emotional clarity is instant, but in reality, it can take time for someone to understand their own feelings, especially when those feelings are mixed with fear, attraction, uncertainty, and past emotional conditioning. During that period, Their behavior becomes the only visible signal you have, even though their internal experience is still under construction. This is where patience and observation become more valuable than reaction. Not passive waiting, but attentive awareness. Not over analyzing every message, but noticing broader behavioral trends over time. Because when someone is truly interested but emotionally processing, their return to engagement tends to happen naturally after periods of withdrawal. There is a rhythm of reconnection that eventually stabilizes. The distance is temporary, even if it repeats in cycles. But when distance becomes prolonged without reconnection, without emotional effort to bridge the gap, that is when the meaning begins to shift toward disinterest or emotional detachment. The distinction is not always immediate, but it becomes clearer with time. Another important point is that your response to her pulling away can influence the emotional direction of the connection, not in a controlling sense, but in a relational sense. When someone feels that their space is respected, they often feel safer returning. When someone feels pressure or urgency during their withdrawal, they may extend that distance further. This is not about playing games or withholding emotion, it is about emotional timing. Some emotions deepen in space while others collapse under pressure. However, it is also important not to misinterpret patience as self neglect. Giving space does not mean ignoring your own emotional needs. If a dynamic consistently leaves you confused, anxious, or uncertain without resolution, that itself becomes information. Because healthy connection, even when complex, still moves toward clarity over time. It does not remain permanently suspended in confusion. And this is where emotional maturity becomes important. Not just understanding her behavior, but also understanding your own emotional threshold, how much uncertainty you can genuinely tolerate, how long you can remain in a dynamic that does not provide stability, and what you are ultimately looking for in connection. Because while it is true that she may want you and still pull away, it is equally true that you need consistency to feel secure in a connection. Both realities exist at the same time. So, the situation is not only about interpreting her behavior, it is also about recognizing your own emotional experience within it. At this point, one of the most important things to understand is how emotional ambiguity affects decision making on both sides. When clarity is missing, the mind naturally tries to fill the gaps with assumptions, and those assumptions are often shaped more by fear than by facts. If you are emotionally invested, you start assuming worst case scenarios when she pulls away. If she is emotionally overwhelmed, she might assume pressure, even when none is intentionally being applied. So both sides begin reacting, not to what is clearly happening, but to what they think might be happening. This is where small misunderstandings quietly grow into emotional distance. Because in many situations, the real issue is not a lack of feeling, but a lack of alignment in emotional interpretation. You might see silence as uncertainty about you, while she might see silence as a necessary reset for herself. You might see reduced communication as a warning sign, while she might see it as normal emotional breathing space. The same behavior, two completely different meanings. And when meanings don't match, connection starts to feel unstable. Even if attraction is still present, another layer that plays a role here is emotional projection. When someone pulls away, your mind doesn't only respond to their current behavior, it also brings in past experiences. Maybe someone before her also became distant. Maybe you've experienced inconsistency in other connections. So when you notice similar patterns, your emotional memory activates those old feelings. And suddenly, what is happening now feels heavier than it actually is. This is why the present moment often gets mixed with past emotional residue. You are not only reacting to her distance, you are also reacting to everything distance has meant to you before. On the other side, she might also be carrying her own emotional projections. If she has ever experienced relationships where closeness led to disappointment, pressure, or emotional imbalance, she may associate increasing attachment with risk. So even if things are going well, part of her mind might stay alert for signs that things could shift negatively. And that internal alert system can influence her behavior in subtle ways, like creating space before things feel too much. This is why emotional withdrawal can sometimes be preventative rather than reactive. It is not always a response to a problem. Sometimes it is an attempt to avoid a future one. But what makes this dynamic even more complex is that both people can be acting in good faith while still creating confusion for each other. You may be trying to understand her. She may be trying to manage her own emotional balance, but without direct communication, both internal processes remain invisible, and invisible processes often lead to misinterpretation. That is why emotional clarity is not just about behavior, but also about expression. Without expression, behavior becomes the only language, and behavior alone is often incomplete. Another important point is how attraction behaves under uncertainty. Many people assume attraction either grows or disappears in a straight line, but in reality, attraction can fluctuate when emotional safety is not established. If she feels emotionally safe, attraction tends to stabilize and deepen. If she feels uncertain or internally conflicted, attraction can still exist but may not express itself consistently. This is why someone can be genuinely interested in you and still not act consistently interested. The feeling is there, but the expression is interrupted by internal processing. And during that processing, space becomes a tool for clarity. When she steps back, she is not only distancing herself from you, she is also trying to observe her feelings without immediate influence because presence creates emotional intensity and absence creates perspective, and both are needed for understanding. From your perspective, however, absence feels like loss of momentum. It feels like something is slipping away. So, while she is trying to gain clarity, you may be experiencing emotional uncertainty. Two different internal goals happening at the same time. This is where timing becomes the silent factor that decides emotional direction. If both people adjust to each other's timing, connection stabilizes. If timing stays misaligned for too long, emotional distance increases, even if attraction remains. Another subtle but powerful factor here is emotional responsiveness. How someone responds during moments of distance can influence the overall direction of the connection. If she pulls away and receives pressure, repeated questioning, or emotional urgency, it can reinforce her need for space, not because she is rejecting you, but because her internal system associates pressure with loss of control. On the other hand, if she pulls away and experiences calmness, steadiness, and lack of emotional escalation, it can create a sense of safety that allows her to return naturally because she does not feel forced or emotionally cornered. But this is not about strategic behavior, it is about emotional regulation. The energy you bring during uncertain moments often shapes how safe the connection feels over time. Still, there is a line that often gets overlooked. Giving space is healthy only when the connection still has movement. If distance becomes the dominant pattern without meaningful return, engagement, or emotional effort, then it stops being processing and starts becoming disengagement. This is where emotional honesty becomes necessary, not just with the other person, but with yourself because staying in prolonged uncertainty can slowly drain emotional energy even when feelings are present. And one of the hardest things to accept in these situations is that understanding someone's behavior does not automatically resolve the emotional impact of it. You can fully understand why she pulls away and still feel unsettled by it. You can recognize that her distance is not personal and still feel affected by it because emotional understanding and emotional experience are two different layers. One is intellectual clarity, the other is emotional reality. Both matter. And over time, what truly determines the direction of any connection is not just attraction, not just fear, not just timing, but whether both people can find a rhythm that feels sustainable, a rhythm where closeness does not feel overwhelming and space does not feel like disconnection, a rhythm where communication does not create pressure and silence does not create confusion. When that rhythm is missing, even strong feelings struggle to maintain stability. And when it is present, even uncertainty becomes manageable. So when she wants you but pulls away, the real meaning is rarely found in the moment itself. It is found in the pattern behind the moments, the emotional state behind the behavior, and the consistency or inconsistency of how she returns after distance. Because in the end, emotional connection is not defined by how close someone gets once, but by how they move between closeness and distance over time, and whether that movement still leads back to you with intention or slowly away without it.